Arunachala Shiva, Arunachala Shiva, Arunachala Shiva, Arunachala, Arunachala Shiva, Arunachala Shiva, Arunachala Shiva, Arunachala, Arunachalam enna ahamē niṇaippavar, ahattai raṟuppā, Arunachala, Aruṇācala Shiva, Aruṇācala Shiva, Aruṇācala Shiva, Aruṇācala, Aruṇācala Shiva, Aruṇācala Shiva, Aruṇācala Shiva, Aruṇācala.
Namaskaram. That was Sadhu Om singing the first verse of Akṣaramaṇamālai, which I will be, which is the subject I'm going to be talking about today. This verse is a tremendously important verse. It is extremely deep in meaning and in implication. This, as I said last time when I was talking, introducing this work, Akṣaramaṇamālai is the very heart of Bhagavan's teachings. And the very heart of his teachings, the very heart of Akṣaramaṇamālai, he expressed in this first verse. What is the purpose of all of Bhagavan's teachings? And most especially, what is the purpose of Arunacha Akṣaramaṇamālai? It is eradication of ego. Where Ulladu Napadu ends, there Akṣaramaṇamālai begins. In the final verse of Ulladu Napadu, Bhagavan says, ahattai uru aridal mukti, destruction of the form of ego is liberation. So the conclusion of Ulladu Napadu is that we can attain liberation only by annihilating ego. And Bhagavan begins Akṣaramaṇamālai from where he ends Ulladu Napadu, which is an eradicating ego. This is the whole purpose of Bhagavan's teachings. And how can we eradicate ego? Only by turning our mind deep within, as Bhagavan implies in this verse. What he says in this verse is, Arunachalam ahamē niṇaippavar, ahattai raṟuppāy Arunachala. This has several meanings. The one meaning is you will eradicate the ego of those who think that Arunachalam is actually I. Another meaning is you will eradicate the ego of those who think Arunachalam deep within the heart. Deep is not there, but within the heart or within the mind. So these are the two principal meanings. There are other meanings also, which I'll discuss as I go along. The one word that he uses twice in this verse is aham. Aham is a particularly important word in Bhagavan's teachings because it is a Tamil word that means inside, mind, heart, or home. And it is also a Sanskrit pronoun that means I. So Bhagavan often used aham to convey a double meaning. Because though these Tamil and Sanskrit words are entirely unrelated as far as their etymology are concerned, their respective etymologies are concerned, there is a certain overlap in their meaning that is particularly relevant in the context of his teachings. Because I is itself the heart in the deepest sense of this word. That is, Bhagavan often used the terms that mean heart, terms such as aham, ulam, hridayam, and so on. The heart is a term that can have different meanings in different contexts. So the deepest meaning of the term heart is the very core or center of ourself. In other words, our fundamental awareness, I am. What we actually are, that is the heart. Of course, heart is also used in a somewhat less deep sense to mean the the deepest part of our mind. Often we refer to the emotional side of our mind as the heart. So the heart has many different meanings, and we have to understand from the context in which it's being used. But the deepest sense in its very deepest sense, the meaning of the word heart is I. So, as I say, aham in Tamil means, one of the meanings in Tamil is heart. In Sanskrit, it means I. And aham is often, in the Sanskrit sense, it's often used in Tamil, particularly in Tamil literature, Tamil poetry, because in ancient times, anyone who knew Tamil well would also know Sanskrit, and in South India, those who were scholars of Tamil would also know. Scholars of Sanskrit would also know Tamil, because any educated person would study both their mother tongue and Sanskrit. And since Tamil is a classical language like Sanskrit, all Tamil poets in ancient times would have known Sanskrit, so they very freely used Sanskrit vocabulary in Tamil. And of course, Tamil has in many ways influenced Sanskrit. Many Sanskrit words are of Tamil origin, and also a lot of Sanskrit, a lot of the character of the language of Sanskrit is borrowed from Tamil and other Dravidian languages. There are features that Sanskrit possesses but it possesses in common with Dravidian languages, but it doesn't. But other Indo-European languages don't have, because Sanskrit was heavily influenced by Tamil. So the two languages were used side by side. So when Bhagavan uses the word aham in Tamil, sometimes he's using it in the sense of the Tamil word, sometimes he's using it in the sense of the Sanskrit pronoun I, and many times he uses it with a double meaning, which is particularly appropriate in the context of his teaching, because, as I say, I is itself the heart, and even when we use I in a more superficial sense to refer to ego rather than to our real nature, which is its real import, as he says in verse 21 of Upadesha Undiyā. In verse 21 of Upadesha Undiyā, he says, referring to what he had said in the previous verse, but our real nature will shine forth as I am I. And in the Sanskrit, he says, Spurati Hritsvayam, the heart will shine forth. Aham taya spurati Hritsvayam. That is, the heart is what will shine forth as I am I. So, in the next verse, in verse 21 of Upadesha Undiyā, Bhagavan says that this, meaning the heart, or that which shines forth as I am I, is always the true import of the word I, because of the absence of our non-existence in sleep. In other words, because even though ego doesn't exist in sleep, we continue to exist. So the real import of the word I is only the heart, our real nature. So the deepest meaning of the word I refers to our real nature of the heart. That's the true import of the word I. But even when we use I to refer to ego, it is still inside. So however we look at it, in the light of Bhagavan's teachings, the Sanskrit word and Tamil word, but happen to be the same in their spelling and in their pronunciation and form, are actually the same. There's a significant overlap in their meaning. So often Bhagavan uses the word aham with a double meaning, both the Tamil meaning of inside or heart and the Sanskrit meaning of I. So that's why Bhagavan, in Akṣaramaṇamālai, will come across many verses in which Bhagavan uses this word aham, and in the other works of Bhagavan also. So he uses this word twice in this verse. First, in the first line, he says ahamē, and in the second line, he says ahattai. which is an accusative case form of aham. In the first line, when he says ahamē, the A is an intensifier. So it implies actually, certainly, or only. And in this case, it can also be interpreted as indicating the locative case. So it can also mean in. So ahamē means not only actually I, certainly I, or only I, but also in the heart or in the mind. The word niṇa is a quotative particle. So in this case, it can mean either as or that, and it can also serve the same function as inverted commas in English. So Arunachalam niṇa ahamē means both that Arunachala is actually, certainly, or only I, and as Arunachala in the mind or heart. Moreover, since ahamē also means actually within, only within, or within the heart, Aruṇācala ahamē can also be interpreted as that Arunachala is actually within, in the sense that Arunacha is actually what is deep within our heart. So these, though Bhagavan uses very, very simple words, they're very, very rich and deep in meaning. Regarding the first of these three meanings, that is, but Arunacha is actually I, or certainly I, or only I, as I mentioned while discussing the Pairam last time, Murugan explains that this intensifying suffix a in ahamē can be transposed from aham to Arunachalam, in which case Arunachalam niṇa ahamē would be construed as Arunachalam aham niṇa, meaning that Arunachalam alone is I, rather than that Arunachala is only I, as it would mean if the A were not transposed. This transposition doesn't change the meaning if we take A to mean actually or certainly, because whether we say Arunachala is certainly I, or certainly Arunachala is I, or actually Arunachala is I, or Arunachala is actually I, it doesn't change the meaning. But it does make a subtle change in emphasis if we take A to mean only or alone. Because if we say only Arunachalam is I, that implies that I is nothing other than Arunachalam. Whereas if we say Arunachalam is only I, that implies that Arunachala is nothing other than I, which is true in a sense, but it could be misinterpreted to mean that Arunachala is not also what appears externally in the form of a hill. That is, what Arunachalam actually is only I. But so long as we experience ourselves as I am this body, out of his infinite love and compassion for us, Arunachalam also appears externally in the form of this hill. Before I go on further in this subject, there's just one other thing I forgot to mention. That is, people who are not familiar with Tamil may wonder why Bhagavan uses the word, refers to Arunachala here as Arunachalam with an M on the end. That is, in Sanskrit, the noun is Arunachala. Achala means what is unmoving, and Aruna has various meanings. It means the sun, it means red, what is red in color. It's got several meanings. It also, another meaning that Bhagavan alludes to in the verses he translated from Arunacha Mahatmyam. There are 7 verses, beginning of introductory verses to Arunacha Stuti Panchakam, which Bhagavan translated from Arunacha Mahatmyam, from Sanskrit verses. In one of those verses, he points out that runam, one of the meanings of runam is bondage. So aruṇā is that which frees from bondage. So this is the hill that frees from bondage. So there are so many meanings contained within the name Arunachala. But as I say, Arunachala is a Sanskrit word. In Tamil, the nominative form of Arunachala, if we take it as an impersonal noun, it is Arunachalam with an M on the end. If we take it as a personal noun, as it is sometimes referred to, it then becomes Arunachalam with an N on the end. Arunachalam, as I say in Tamil, that's the nominative neuter form of Arunachala, whereas Arunachalam is the nominative masculine form or personal form of Arunachalam. Both are the same because Arunachala is both personal and impersonal, but here Bhagavan is using the impersonal form. So sorry, that was just a digression, but the main point I was making is when Bhagavan says Arunachalam ena ahamē, Murugan suggests transposing the A from the ahamē to Arunachalam, so that to make it clear, but Arunachala alone is what shines as I. If we take it as Arunacha, but Arunacha is only I, that could seem to exclude the fact that but Arunacha also appears externally in the form of a hill, which, as he does out of his immense love and compassion for us. Because so long as we take ourselves to be the form of a body, we are looking outwards, and so we cannot know him as formless. That is, as Bhagavan says in verse 4 of Ulurunapadu, Uruvam Tanayin Uluhu Paramatram. If oneself is a form, the world and God will be likewise. Uruvam Tanandrel, if oneself is not a form, Uvatrin Uruvate Kan Urudul Yaban Evan. If oneself is not a form, who can see their form and how? So the world and God seem to be forms so long as we seem to be a form. When we recognize ourselves as formless, then only can we know God as formless. And the world will also, formlessness is one infinite indivisible whole, because forms are, every form is something finite, it's something separate from something else, from everything else. Whereas what is formless has no limits, no boundaries, and therefore it's infinite. So when we know ourselves as formless, there is nothing other than ourselves. So God and the world are nothing other than ourselves. So long as we are looking outwards, we are aware of ourselves as I am this body, so it's appropriate to worship Arunachala in the form of this hill. But when we look inwards, he is that formless awareness that is always shining in our heart as I. So this is what Bhagavan implies in verse 3 of Arunacha Ashtakum, which is a very, very, very beautiful and a verse very, well, like all the Bhagavan's verses, it's very, very deep in meaning. What he says in this verse is, Niṇaiyan uruvena eniye nanna nilamise malayanam nilaini nidan. When I approach thinking of you as a form, you yourself stand as a hill on earth. Unnuru aruena unnidil vinnokura uluhu alai tarum oruvanai no okum. If one thinks of or meditates upon your form as formless, one is like someone who wanders about the world in order to see the sky. Unnuru unolara unnida munnir uru sarukarai uru ena uru oyam. When without thinking, one thinks of your form, one's own form will cease to exist, like a sugar form. Literally means sugar form, but it implies a salt doll immersed in the ocean. Eneyan arivura ennuruvera. When I know myself, what else is my form? Implying what is my form other than you when I know myself? Irundane Aruna Bangiri Edna Irundoi. You who exist as the great Aruna hill alone are. So that's the meaning of that verse. I'll explain this a little because it's a very, very important verse. So long as we rise and stand as ego, we're aware of ourselves as a form. I am this body. So whatever idea we have about God or Arunachala being formless is just an idea or thought, which is a mental form. So that is, many people think, oh, it's wrong to worship, God is formless, so it's wrong to worship him in a form. But even the very idea that he is formless is just an idea, it's just a belief. And every idea is just a mental form. So we cannot know God as formless so long as we know ourselves as a form. So in order to know his formless nature, we need to know ourselves devoid of form. And hence, even the so-called formless God that we may try to worship is just an idea, a mental form. This is the significance of what he says in the second line of this verse. Unnuru aruena unnidil, binnokura ulahu alaitarum oruvane nok okum. If one thinks of your form as formless, one is like someone who wanders about the world in order to see the sky. What is the significance of this analogy that Bhagavan gives here? That is, the sky is just space, which is here and now. We are in space. Space is everywhere around us. We don't have to go anywhere to find space. So wandering to the ends of the earth in order to see the sky close up is futile because the sky is here and now. What we see as seemingly distant blue canopy is the very same space that we are seeing here, but we are immersed in here and now. So the implication of this analogy is it's just like it's futile to wander around the world to get a close look at the sky, because however far you may wander, the sky still seems to be far away when actually it's here and now. So it's equally futile to try to think of or meditate upon God as formless. If we want to know him as formless, we need to know ourselves as formless. So in order to know him as formless, we need to stop thinking by turning our entire attention back within in order to see what we ourselves actually are. Because only when we see ourselves as formless can we know him as formless. As Bhagavan implies in the third line, unnuru unalara unnida munne uru sarukarai uru ena uru oyam. When one thinks without thinking of your form, one's own form will cease to exist, like a salt doll immersed in the ocean. That is, what does Bhagavan mean when he says thinking without thinking? The attention we pay to anything, that paying attention to anything other than ourselves is thinking. So when instead of attending to anything else, we attend to ourselves, we are not actually thinking, we are just being. But metaphorically, we can say we are thinking. What are we thinking of? We're not thinking of anything other than ourselves. We're thinking of ourselves alone. So attending to ourselves, being self-attentive, is what Bhagavan describes as thinking without thinking. And he says, thinking without thinking of your form. Well, that's how we have to express it. In English, we say think of, but in Tamil, they say it more directly. They say thinking your form. So when we think his form, thinking his form means what is his form? His form is that which is shining in our heart as I. So attending to I, that is thinking his form or thinking of his form. But by attending to I, we are not actually thinking. We are withdrawing our mind from all thoughts and turning it within, back to the source from which even the first thought I arises. So this is, Bhagavan describes self-attentiveness as thinking without thinking. And what is the object of which we are thinking? of course, it's not an object. His form is not an object. It's the reality of the subject. But that which we are thinking of is only his form, which is I. That which is always shining out in our heart as I, that is Arunachalam. So thinking without thinking of your form means when we attend only to I am, which is the true form or swarupa of Arunachala. And then he says, so that when we do so, munne uru sarukare uru eṇa uruoyam. That is, uruoyam means form will cease, or form will cease, in the sense form will cease to exist. That means my form, that is my separate individuality, ego, will cease to exist when I think of you, or he doesn't even say when one thinks of you, one's own form, meaning ego, will cease to exist. And then he gives an analogy. Munne means three waters. It's a way of referring to the ocean, because the ocean is, the rivers flow into the ocean, the rain pours into the ocean, and forgotten what the other water is. Anyway, it's in Tamil poetry, where ocean is often referred to as three waters. It's a place where all water collects. He uses the term here, sarukare uru. That literally means a sugar form. But people may think, oh, well, I've heard of putting a salt doll in the ocean, but never a sugar doll. There's a reason why Bhagavan used the word sugar here. That is, in the part of Tamil Nadu which Bhagavan comes from, the Madurai area, in the community from which Bhagavan comes, it is considered not proper etiquette to talk about salt when you're eating a meal. So if, for example, you're having a meal and you want to have a little bit more salt, if you ask for, can I have a bit more salt, that is considered as not such a polite way of saying it. So conventionally, what they say is, can I have a little sugar? And then the host will understand that the sugar you're asking for is salt, and they'll put a little more salt on your leaf, and you can add that to your food. So that is why, though the words sarukare, it literally means sakare, sugar, it's actually, Bhagavan is here referring to a salt doll. That is, it's often, the analogy is often used of putting a salt doll in the ocean. If a salt doll is put in the ocean, it dissolves and it becomes part of the ocean. So ceasing to exist like a salt doll immersed in the ocean means you completely dissolve and cease to exist in that. So how can we dissolve and cease to exist in Arunachala? In other words, how can ego be eradicated? Only by thinking of him without thinking. So when in this first verse of Akṣaramaṇamālai, when Bhagavan says, when one thinks, you root out the ego of those who think of you in the heart. The thinking he's talking about is thinking without thinking of your form. In other words, being self-attentive. So only when we look deep within ourselves to contemplate or meditate on the true form of Arunachalam, which is what is shining in our heart as I, then only will ego be eradicated and will we dissolve like a salt doll in the ocean. So all these, that is Bhagavan, if we understand Bhagavan's teachings correctly, he's talking about one thing and one thing alone throughout his teachings, whether it is Nana or Uludunapadu or Upadeshundya or Anma-Bidde or any of these songs of Arunacha Stuti Panchakam. Bhagavan is talking about one thing and one thing alone, the eradication of ego. And how to eradicate ego? Only by looking deep within our own heart. So the reason when I'm discussing these verses, why I often refer to other passages of Bhagavan's teachings, other portions of Arunacha Stuti Panchakam or passages from Uludunapadu or Nana or whatever, is all of Bhagavan's teachings are so intimately connected. That is, Bhagavan is talking about the same subject, just in so many different ways, he's talking about the same thing. So Bhagavan's teachings are all about turning our attention within and thereby merging back into our source. In other words, thinking without thinking of the true form of Arunachala, which is always shining in our heart as I, we thereby subside and dissolve in him like a salt doll in the ocean. So that is when we think deeply about Bhagavan's teaching, there are so many beautiful connections because he's saying the same thing in so many different ways. But what he is saying, though he says it in many different ways, it's one thing he's saying. Why does he say it in so many different ways? Because what he is pointing at is actually beyond thought, beyond words. No words can adequately express the teachings of Bhagavan. So all the words he uses, they're all just various different pointers, but they're all pointing in the same direction. They're all pointing our attention back at ourselves, prompting us to look deep within ourselves to see who am I. So, as I say, the reason he describes being self-attentive here as thinking of without thinking is attending to anything other than ourselves is thinking or mental activity, whereas being self-attentive brings about the cessation of all mental activities. So, so if we think of ourselves, all thinking comes to an end. So that is thinking without thinking. So since the real form of Arunachala is Atma-vichara, our own real nature, he describes being keenly self-attentive as thinking without thinking of your form. When we think without thinking of Arunachala Swarupa, the real form of Arunachala, our own form or separate individuality will dissolve in him like a salt doll immersed in the ocean. Therefore, he concludes this verse by saying in the last line, Eneyan arivura enuru veru edu. That is, when I know myself, what else is my form? What else is my form means, it implies what else is my form other than you? That is, we seem to have a separate existence only when we look outwards. When we look outwards, we're aware of ourselves as I am this body. So we are not aware of ourselves as we actually are. But if we're aware of ourselves as we actually are, what are we? What is our true form? Our true form is that fundamental awareness, that pure awareness that is always shining in our heart as I am. So when I know myself means when I know myself as I alone. When I know I am I have no separate existence other than you, because you are I. And so when I know myself as I know myself as you. I know that I'm nothing other than you. So that's the significance of this rhetorical question. When I know myself, what else is my form? That means when I know myself, who am I other than you? And then to emphasize this, he's in the final sentence, he says, Irandane Aruna Vangiriyena Irandoi. You who exist at the great Aruna hill alone, well, it doesn't say alone are, but it implies you alone are. Since Arunachala alone is what actually exists, how can we be anything other than Arunachala? If we claim to be something other than Arunachala, we are belittling Arunachala. We are belittling the infinite whole by saying I am separate from the infinite whole. I am God are different. I am separate from God. That is a great blasphemy. Well, once a Christian missionary asked Bhagavan, is it not a great blasphemy to say that I and God are one? Bhagavan said, is it not even an even greater blasphemy to say I am other than God? Because how can there be anything other than God? If God is the infinite whole, nothing can be other than him. So Arunachala is the great Aruna hill. That which is shining as this great Aruna hill is the one infinite whole. So how can anything be other than that? When we look outwards, we are aware of ourselves as I am this body. So Arunachalam likewise seems to be a form, the form of this great hill. which is so beloved to the heart of Bhagavan. But when we look deep within our own heart, the adjunct, this body will drop off from I am this body, and then Arunachalam alone will remain shiny as I am. So the true form of Arunachala is that which is shiny in our heart as I am. So long as we are looking outwards and therefore mistaking ourselves to be a body, Arunachala, out of his immense love and compassion for us, appears outwardly in the form of this great hill. In other words, Arunachalam seems to be separate from ourselves only so long as we rise and stand as ego, whose nature is always to look outwards at things other than itself. But when we look back deep within ourselves to see what we actually are, we will thereby sink deep within and dissolve in him. And thus we will see that this I that we now mistake to be the form of a body is actually nothing other than Arunachalam itself. So this is why Murugan suggested transposing the intensifier from aham to Arunachalam. So it becomes Arunachalam alone is I. That is, there is no I other than Arunachalam. If we think of him with that understanding, but Arunacha is that which is shiny but Arunacha alone is that which is shiny in our heart as I, our attention thereby goes deep within, and thereby ego is eradicated, as implied in this verse. So in this first verse of Akṣaramaṇamālai, the main verse we're talking about, in this first verse, niṇaippava means those who think. So calameṉa, ahamē niṇaippava means those who think that Arunachala is actually I, or certainly I, or that Arunachalam alone is I. That's one meaning. Those who think Arunachalam deep within the heart or mind. And another third meaning is those who think that Arunacha is actually deep within, only within or within the heart. So if we combine the first and second of these three meanings together, calameṉa, ahamē, niṇaippava implies those who think deep within the heart or mind, but Arunacha is actually I. That is, thinking that Arunacha is I here doesn't mean thinking I am Arunacha. It is with the understanding that what is shiny in our heart as I, we attend to him deep within our heart as I alone. That is the implication. Or if we combine all three meanings together, we can take this phrase as implying those who think within the heart or mind, but Arunacha is actually within, existing and shining eternally as I. That's the implication. Then the next word is ahattai. As I mentioned earlier, ahattai is an accusative case form of aham, which in this case is, here aham is used in the, we can take it in the Sanskrit sense also, but it's mainly we have to take it in the Tamil sense, aham meaning the mind or heart, but in this case, mind or ego, we can say. We could also, by a stretch of the imagination, say ahattai is referring to I, ego, but it wouldn't be usual in Sanskrit to put a accusative case, a Tamil accusative case ending on the Sanskrit word. So, but anyway, it doesn't matter. However we take it, it all amounts to the same thing. Whether we take aham here to mean I, or mind, or ego, it's all the same thing. And as I say, it's accusative. So it is the object of the verb. The verb is raṟuppāy. There means root. And in some contexts, it can also mean foundation or cause. And aruṇācalā is a second person singular future or predictive form of aru, which means to cut, sever, separate, exterminate, or remove. So veraru means to cut the root or root out or eradicate. And veraruppāy therefore means you will root out or you will eradicate. Therefore, ahattai raṟuppāy means you will eradicate ego or mind. Muruganar, who is a master at giving all sorts of, finding all sorts of deep meanings in Tamil words, he points out, but aham is also a Tamil form of the Sanskrit word aga, which means sin or impurity or pain or suffering. I don't know if I pronounced that right. My pronunciation is very good. If it's transliterated into English, it's agha, that Sanskrit word. That is the aspirated ga, aga, which means sin, impurity, evil, pain, or suffering. So ahattai raṟuppāy can also be interpreted to mean you will eradicate sin, or you will eradicate impurity, evil, pain, suffering. So we're going to see so many different meanings in this verse and in all these verses. That is, Muruganar's commentary is very, very terse. But if we read it carefully, there's he gives so many pointers to different shades of meaning and different depths and levels of meaning. So Muruganar's commentary, it is not at all an easy commentary to read. Some people say it's much easier to read, to understand Bhagavan Tamil poetry than to understand Muruganar's Tamil prose. But if we read it attentively, it is very, very deep in meaning. Robert Butler has translated it into English, which is a Herculean undertaking, because to translate Muruganar is very, very difficult. I like to read the original because it's almost impossible to express in English what Muruganar is saying in Tamil. Robert has done a pretty good job of it. And I find Robert's translation is not satisfactory, but it does help me a lot to understand Muruganar. Though I would express it differently if I were to try and translate Muruganar, though I don't think I'm as qualified as Robert is. But Robert's translation helps me to understand the Tamil. But of course, when I read it in Tamil, I'm able to see much more in it than comes out in the English translation. But as I say, Muruganar's commentary it's an invaluable treasure, but it needs to be read very, very carefully. And there are portions of Muruganar's Tamil commentary which, even with Robert's English translation, I still don't understand what Muruganar is saying, because Muruganar is extremely deep. I doubt if Robert has understood. Robert's English translation in places, it didn't really, I understand what the words mean, but exactly what Muruganar is implying by the words he used, in places I'm mystified. Maybe his words will reveal their meaning to me later on. Who knows? But still, for anyone who knows Tamil, though it may be a difficult undertaking, it's really very, very well worthwhile reading Muruganar's commentary, because it's, as I say, though he expresses things very cryptically, and sometimes he just, in one or two words, he indicates something that you could write pages on, because he expresses things in such a compact and often quite cryptic manner. But it's well worth any effort you put into reading Muruganar's commentary. Is well worth it. And if you can't understand, if you don't know Tamil, then Robert's English translation is well worth reading. Not, as I say, I don't think he's fully brought out the meaning of Muruganar's commentary, but it's almost impossible to do so in another language. But if like me, you've got a little knowledge of Tamil, but not a very deep knowledge of Tamil, then reading Muruganar's commentary along with Robert's English translation is very, very helpful. So anyway, coming back to this this meaning that Murugan has suggested here, but it can also mean you root out, you will eradicate or root out sin or impurity or evil or pain. Since ego is the root of all sin, impurity, evil, pain, and suffering, being the one who commits sins and does evil deeds and who consequently experiences pain and suffering as a fruit of such actions, the principal meaning of this clause, namely you will eradicate ego, entails all these secondary meanings. However, it's still worth bearing in mind. I mean, it's worth being aware of these other shades of meaning here. Because when Murugan points out this, it reminds us that ego, but what is the root of all sin, all impurity, all evil? It is only ego. We look outside and we see so much suffering in the world. We see so much evil in the world, people doing terrible things to each other. But what is the root of all this? It's all only ego. Because who is the one who does all sins? Who is the one who does evil deeds? It is only ego. Who is the one who experiences pain and suffering as the fruit of evil deeds done in the past? It is only ego. And when we are looking on seeing evil and seeing suffering, in whose view does all this evil and suffering exist? Only in the view of ourself as ego. So ego is the root cause of all these problems we see. Therefore, what is the ultimate aim of life, the ultimate aim of all spiritual endeavor? It is nothing but eradication of ego. There cannot be any spiritual attainment higher than or beyond eradication of ego. When ego is eradicated, what alone actually exists remains as it is alone, without anything else. So there cannot be anything beyond the eradication of ego. But ego is the root of all sin, all impurity, all pain, all suffering, all evil. Therefore, the ultimate aim of all spiritual endeavor, indeed the ultimate aim of all the endeavors made by all jivas, is nothing but eradication of ego. Because what are we all seeking? Whatever good actions or bad actions we may be doing, but one thing we are all seeking, the worst sinners and the greatest saints, they're all seeking only one thing and one thing alone: happiness. From the smallest ant to the highest gods in heaven, all embodied beings are seeking, all sentient and embodied beings are all seeking happiness. Why are we seeking happiness? Because happiness is our own real nature. We ourselves are infinite happiness. But when we rise as ego, we seem to have limited ourselves to this small finite entity, the small person we seem to be now. As this small finite person, we cannot experience the infinite happiness that we actually are. So in order to experience the infinite happiness that we are all seeking, the only means that we cannot attain that happiness without eradicating ego. So the only worthy aim in life is eradication of ego. And that is what Bhagavan's teachings are all about. Aruṇācala, ahamē, niṇaippavar, ahattai, raṟuppāy, Arunachala. That is, Arunachala appeared in the form of this hill only to eradicate ego. Arunachala appeared in the form of Bhagavan only to eradicate ego. So this is what Arunachala is all about. This is what Bhagavan is all about. And this is what has drawn us to Bhagavan's teaching, because this is the ultimate. There is nothing beyond this, nothing beyond the simple eradication of ego. And how to eradicate ego? Only by looking deep within ourselves, by recognizing that Arunachala is that which is ever shining in our heart as I, and consequently looking deep within ourselves to see who am I. This is the means to eradicate ego, as Bhagavan implies in this verse and throughout his teachings. So this verse has two principal meanings. One is Arunachalam, you will eradicate the ego of those who think that Arunachala is actually I, or that Arunachala alone is I. And the second meaning is, you will eradicate the ego of those who think Arunachalam within the heart, implying deep within the heart or mind. As I say, ahamē can mean in the heart or in the mind. It amounts to the same thing in this context. Another meaning is, Arunachalam, you will eradicate the ego of those who think that Arunachalam is deep within. But since what exists and shines deep within our heart, as the heart, is only I, the implication of this third meaning is much the same as the first meaning. The second of these three meanings is appropriate for those who are more drawn to niṇaippavar, that is the devotional attitude or idea that God is aṇya. Aṇya means what is other than oneself. Aṇya means other, and it implies other than oneself, which is the preliminary stage of the path of self-surrender or bhakti. Whereas the first and third meanings are appropriate for those who are more drawn to niṇaippava, the understanding that God is not other, aṇya, than oneself. Aṇya means not other. So God, the understanding that God is not other than oneself, that is niṇaippava. So whereas niṇaippava is the preliminary stage of the path of bhakti and self-surrender, the more advanced stage of the path of bhakti and self-surrender is niṇaippava, the understanding that God or Arunachala is that which is shining in our heart as I. This is what Bhagavan implies in verse 8 of Upadesha Undiyā. Niṇaippavatin avana hamahum vahamē undipara anaitinam uttamam undipara. What that means is, rather than niṇaippava, niṇaippava, in which he is I, is certainly the best among all. As I say, niṇaippava means taking God to be meditating on God as if he's something other than oneself, whereas niṇaippava means meditating on him as nothing other than oneself. In other words, as I alone. And he says, avana hamahum niṇaippava. That means niṇaippava in which he is I. That implies in which when we understand that he is that which is shining in our heart as I, how do we meditate upon him? Only by meditating on I. In other words, only by being self-attentive. So niṇaippava in this context means being self-attentive. And why does he say it is the best among all? Well, in the context of Upadesha Undiyā, that is what he's been talking about in the preceding 5 or 6 verses, is about different means of purifying the mind, different actions we can do to purify the mind. And he's been grading them. Better than puja is japa, better than japa is dhyana. And among japa, better the mental japa than japa said softly within the mouth. And better japa said softly in the mouth than japa said aloud. And better japa said aloud than stotras. And and better than this japa is dhyana. And mental japa is a type of dhyana. But among dhyanas, rather than meditating upon God interruptedly, that is intermittently, meditating on him continuously, like a river or a flow of ghee, is better. But then in this verse, he says, rather than meditating on God as something other than ourselves, meditating on him as nothing other than ourselves. In other words, meditating on him alone, this is the best among all. That means it is the most effective means to purify the mind. It is also the best among all because it is the only means to eradicate ego. We cannot, ego is the root of all the impurities that we are trying to, that all spiritual practices are aimed at purifying the mind. What is the root of all impurities? It is ego. So the best way to purify the mind is to eradicate ego. And how to eradicate ego? only by Aruṇācalā. Arunachalam ena ahamē niṇaippava, that means thinking that Arunachala is actually I, is what he describes in this verse as, in this verse 8 of Upadeshundya, as abanahamaham ananyabhavam. That is ananyabhava, in which he is I, which implies meditating on nothing other than I, with the understanding that he, namely God or Arunachalam, is what shines as I. This practice, this should not be, people often reading this superficially, even reading this first verse of Akṣaramaṇamālai superficially, we could take it to mean, but Bhagavan is talking here about soham bhavana, meditating, I am Arunacha, or soham, or shivaham. That is not what Bhagavan means here, because meditating on a thought such as Arunachala is I, or he is I, or Shiva is I, all these are thoughts, and thoughts are all anya. They're all other than ourselves. We were not born with the thought, I am Shivaham or Soham, were we? After we learn a little bit of Vedanta philosophy, then we know, oh, I am God. But that is just an idea. It's just a belief that we have. It is not our actual experience. And so long as we're meditating on that idea, we're meditating on something other than ourselves. Meditating on the Mahavakyas doesn't mean meditating on the words of the Mahavakya, thinking aham brahmasmi. It means meditating on the import of the Mahavakya. What is when it is said tatvamasi or aham brahmasmi, you are that, or I am Brahman, what is the implication of that? There is no Brahman, there is no tat, that, no Shiva or no Arunachala, or no God other than I. He is that which is shining in our heart as I. So how should we meditate on him? Only by meditating on I. Meditating on any thought such as he is I, is meditating on something that is other than ourselves. So it's anyabhava. Though we are thinking that he is I, we are still attending to something other than I, which is that thought he is I. If we really understand that he is I, what should we meditate on? I alone. Because so long as we allow our attention to move away from I, even towards the thought of God, we are still not meditating on him properly. He is that which is shining in our heart as I. So the direct way to meditate on him, the only way to meditate on him without any anya, without any otherness, is by meditating on I alone. So what Bhagavan is talking about in this verse 8 of Upadeshundya, and also in this first verse of Akṣaramaṇamālai, is not soham bhavana. It is ananya bhava. That is meditating on nothing other than oneself, on I alone. Because since we alone are not other than ourselves, ananya bhava can, if understood correctly, if we think about it deeply, ananya bhava cannot mean anything other than meditating on ourselves alone. If we meditate on thoughts such as he is I, we're meditating on something other than ourselves, something that is anya, something that is alien to ourselves. So when it is said that we should, in Vedanta, they often define nididhyasana as meditating on deeply contemplating the import of the Mahavakyas. According to Bhagavan, the import of the Mahavakyas, the purpose of the Mahavakyas, why the Mahavakyas are there. The Mahavakyas are all pointing out our identity with Brahman. Aham brahmasmi, tattvamasi, prajnanam Brahman. Prajnanam Brahman means pure awareness alone is Brahman, or I am Atma Brahman. This very self is Brahman. What is they are all pointing out the fact that Brahman is nothing other than I. So to meditate on the import of the Mahavakyas, in other words, to do nididhyasana, means to attend to I alone. Because if we understand that there is no Brahman other than I, What should we meditate on? We should stop thinking about Brahman as if he is something other than us. So we should meditate on I alone. So that is what Bhagavan is referring to in this verse 8 of Upadeshundya. It is also what he's talking about in this first verse of Akṣaramaṇamālai. Because so long as we're meditating on anything other than ourselves, even on the thought he is I, we are thereby nourishing and sustaining ego, because we are allowing our attention to move away from ourselves towards something else. Only when we focus our entire attention on ourselves alone will ego thereby subside and merge back into its source. That alone is true surrender. So though Aruṇācala meṇa ahamē niṇaippava could be interpreted as meditating on the thought Arunachalam is actually I, that is not the meaning intended by Bhagavan, because ego will be eradicated only when we are so keenly self-attentive that we thereby cease being aware of anything other than ourselves. Yes, Arunachalam is actually I. If we've understood that Arunachalam is actually I, what should we meditate on? Only on I, not on the thought Arunachalam is I, which is something anya, something alien, something other than ourselves. Therefore, Aruṇācala meṇa ahamē niṇaippava, thinking that Aruṇācala is actually I, implies that we should meditate on nothing other than I, with the clear understanding and firm conviction that what shines in our heart as I is only Arunachalam. Because Arunachala Swarupa, the real form of Arunachala, is Atma-vichara, the real form or real nature of ourself, which is the true import of the word I. As Bhagavan says in verse 21 of Upadeshundya that I referred to earlier. Meditating on anything other than ourselves is a thought or mental activity, bhavana, because it entails a movement of our mind or attention away from ourselves towards something else. Whereas meditating on nothing other than ourselves is not a thought or mental activity, because it is just a resting of our mind or attention in our source, in its source, namely ourself, as Bhagavan implies in verse 9 of Upadeshundya. What he says in verse 9 of Upadeshundya is, Bhava balatinal bhavanatita sabbhavatirutale undipara parabhakti tattvam undipara. What that means is, by bhava balam, that is by the strength of meditation, that in this context implies by the strength of ananya bhava, or the strength of self-attentiveness, being in sat-bhava means the state of being, which transcends bhavana, alone is parabhakti tattva. Bhavana here means thinking or meditation in the sense of mental activity. So being self-attentive, to the extent that we are self-attentive, ego thereby subsides, and thereby we remain in the state of sat-bhava, our real state of being, which transcends all mental activity. Here, bhavana implies meditation in the form of mental activity. In other words, meditating on anything other than ourself is a mental activity. Meditating on ourself alone is a cessation of all mental activity. So being in sat-bhava by the strength of self-attentiveness alone is parabhakti tattva. That is the nature or reality or true state of supreme devotion. So better than anya bhava is ananya bhava, because ananya bhava leads us to the state of just being, summa-irupadu, which is just being as we actually are. That is complete surrender of ego, which is parabhakti tattva. So as I say, bhava balam here means the strength of meditation, and it implies the strength, intensity, firmness, and stability of our ananya bhava. So the implication is that by the strength of self-attentiveness, we will subside and remain in our natural state of being, sat-bhava, which transcends all mental activity, bhavana. meditation on anything other than ourselves, even on the thought, he is I, abhanaham or soham, is a mental activity, bhavana. Whereas meditation on ourself alone is not a mental activity, but a subsidence or cessation of all mental activity. So it is not a doing or karma, but a state of just being, sumayirapadu. So being a state of just being, it is the state in which we do not rise as ego. So it is the state of complete self-surrender, which is the culmination and pinnacle of all bhakti. So he says that it is parabhakti tattva, the nature or reality or true state of supreme devotion. He also implies this in the first sentence of the 13th paragraph of Nana, in which he says, Anma chintane tabira, vera chintane kalambavatiku satramidum kadamal, Atmanishta paranai irapade, tanai isanaku alipadam. What that means is, being Atmanishta paran, one who is firmly fixed as oneself, giving not even the slightest room to the rising of any thought other than self-attentiveness, Atmachintana, alone is giving oneself to God. So we need to be in order to surrender ourselves completely to God, to Arunachala, we need to be so keenly self-attentive, but we thereby give no room for the rising of any other thought. In other words, we give no room for our attention to move away from ourselves towards anything else. And by being so keenly self-attentive, we thereby remain as Atmanishta paran. Being Atmanishta paran and being in Satbhava implies the same thing. It's just being as we actually are, being what we actually are, being firmly fixed as ourselves. Therefore, in order to give ourselves entirely to Arunachala, we need to be so keenly and steadily self-attentive, but we thereby give not even the slightest room to the rising of any other thought. By being so keenly and steadily self-attentive, we as ego will sink back deep into the heart, which is the source from which we rose, and will dissolve there forever at the holy feet of Arunachala, who exists and shines eternally in the heart as the heart, namely our own real nature, Atma-swarupa. However, though Bhagavan says in Upadeshundya, Anya bhavatin abanahamahum ananya vahamē anaitimum uttamam, Rabhavan Anya Bhava, Rabhavan Anya Bhava, Ananya Bhava, in which he is I, is certainly the best among all. This is not intended to deny the value or efficacy of Anya Bhava, devotion to God as if he were other than oneself, because such devotion will purify the mind and thereby give it the clarity to understand that God is actually what always exists and shines in our heart as I. This is particularly true of the name and form of Arunachala, because they have a unique power. That is, Arunachala name and form have a unique power to turn the mind back within to face its real nature, Atma-swarupa, which is the true form, Swarupa of Arunachala, as Bhagavan knew from his own experience, and as he reveals, he's revealed it in so many places, but he's revealed it most clearly in verse 10 of Arunachala Patikam. What he says in verse 10 of Arunachala Patikam is, Patanam pudumai, we vili kanta paravatam. Patanam pudumai means I have seen a wonder. We Bali Kanta Paravatam means the magnetic hill that seizes or forcibly attracts the soul. Bali means to force or compel, so it's forcibly attracting. Kanta is magnet and Bali is a force. For those who know Tamil better than me, please excuse my pronunciation. Often I don't pronounce Tamil very well. Then in the next sentence, this is the most important sentence. Orudarum idane ortidum virin setaye oduki oru tanadu abhimukamaha etu ade tanbol achalama seidu ab innuir bali kollum. What that means is, subduing the mischievous or outward flowing mental activity of the soul who thinks of it once, pulling or dragging that soul to face towards itself, the one, or Aru can mean one or peerless. It implies here the one peerless, infinite, pure awareness that shines as I, shines within the heart as I, and thereby making it achala. Achala means motionless, like itself. Tambol, like means like itself. It accepts that sweet soul as bali. Bali means food that is offered in sacrifice. So accepting that sweet soul as bali means he will swallow this sweet soul. So when we are nicely ripened by thinking of him deep within our heart, we will finally become ripe enough, but we'll be sweet and tasty, and he will then swallow us as a sacrificial offering. So by turning our attention within and holding on to self-attentiveness, we are allowing ourselves to ripen, and thereby we are offering ourselves to him. And he will, when we are fully ripened, he will accept us as a sweet offering, and he will consume us. And then in the next sentence, he says, Ishtu en. That means, what is this? Implying, what a wonder is this? And then in the final sentence of this verse, he says, or to we min we call ulumadinal oli if we koli arunamagiriye. That means or to we min means be saved thinking. O souls, we call means O souls. O souls, be saved by thinking of the great Aruna hill, the killer of the soul, who shines in the heart. So Bhagavan is clearly saying Arunacha is that which shines in the heart. He's shining in the heart at that fundamental awareness I am. And thereby, if we turn our attention within, he is Veerkali, he's a killer of the soul. As Bhagavan says in the later verse of Akṣaramaṇamālai, Kodi tadere kollune kati kondengen varben Arunachala. That means Kodi itu means hoisting a flag. Adiare kol une, that means you who kill devotees, hoisting a flag. Une kati kondu engem varven Arunachala. So what that means is Arunachala, embracing you who kill devotees, hoisting a flag, how will I survive? The implication is that is in old days, if a philanthropist was to do some philanthropy, if he was, say, to feed poor people or sadhus or something, to announce that he's on such and such day he's going to feed so many people, he will hoist a flag to announce himself. So Arunachala has hoisted his flag. What has he hoisted his flag to announce? What is the great philanthropy done by Arunachala? He's hoisted his flag to announce, but he will kill those who come to him. So having come to you, having embraced you, how can I survive? So Arunachala is here to kill us, to destroy the soul. But by destroying the soul, he saves us. That's why Bhagavan says, Otu min, that is, Otu means thinking. We min means be saved. So O souls, be saved by thinking of the great Aruna hill, the killer of the soul, who shines in the heart. So this is such an important verse, because in this verse, Bhagavan is explaining how the thought of Arunachala works to draw our mind within. That is, Arunachala is always shining in our heart as I am. But because our mind is constantly directed outwards towards things other than ourselves, out of its infinite love and compassion, Arunachala also appears in the form of this great hill in order to turn our mind back within to face its real form or swarupa, which is Sat-Chit, our fundamental awareness of our own existence, I am. As he sings in the first verse of Śrī Aruṇācala Ashtakum, in the first line of the first verse, Ari Varu Giriyena Amadarum Amma Adisayan Idan Sayal Ari Vari Dakum. That means it sits calmly as a hill, seemingly bereft of awareness. He doesn't even say seemingly, he said bereft of awareness, but it implies seemingly bereft of awareness. But its action is preeminent or wonderful, difficult for anyone to understand. So what is the action of Arunachala that Bhagavan is referring to here? The sail is the word he uses here. Sail means doing or action. So the sail of Arunachala, the doing or action of Arunachala, is just to be in our heart as it is. But by its mere being, it does all that is necessary to draw our mind back within, because its being as I am has a powerful magnetic attraction, which may seem imperceptible to us so long as our mind is facing outwards, but which we will become increasingly aware of to the extent to which we turn back within to face our real nature, Atma-vichara, which is Arunachala itself. That is, the more, so long as we're looking outwards, we may not be aware of the powerful magnet that is ever in our heart. The more we look within, the more we will come under the sway of that great magnet, which is Arunachala shining in our heart as I. That's why he begins this verse 10 of Arunacha Padacchēdam by referring to Arunachala as Kanta Paravatam, that is this magnetic hill, because he is the powerful magnet in our heart that is always drawing our mind inwards. That is, the thought of Arunachala comes to us only by his grace. So as soon as we are granted the great blessing of thinking of the name or form of Arunachala even once, we are thereby caught in the web of its grace. As he sings in verses 102 and 3 of Akṣaramaṇamālai. In verse 102, he sings, Arunayan Dranayan Arulkani Patenum Arulvale Tapumo Arunachala. Arunachala, as soon as I thought as Aruṇā, Aruṇā is the name of Arunachala, I was trapped in the net of your grace. Will the net of your grace ever fail? So as soon as we think of Arunachala, we're caught in his net of grace, and his net of grace will never fail. Bhagavan says, Unarul vale tapumo. He asks it as a question, but it's a rhetorical question. It means he's assuring us here the net of Arunachala's grace will never fail. And if we've once thought of Arunachala, we've been trapped in his grace. And in the next verse, he says, Chindit taropada chilandi pokati chirayet tunranay Arunachala. What that means is literally Arunachala, thinking to be trapped in grace, ensnaring and imprisoning like a tiger, like a spider, you have devoured. What that implies is Arunachala, like a spider that spins a web and it ensnares and devours its prey, thinking or deciding or resolving that I should be trapped in the web of your grace, ensnaring and imprisoning me, you devoured of me. So in verse 102, he's saying, as soon as I thought of you. But in this verse, he's saying, he says, as soon as you thought to trap me. So why do we think of Arunachala? Because he has thought of us. That is, as Bhagavan often used to say, grace is the beginning, the middle, and the end of this spiritual path. It is grace that draws us to the spiritual path. It is grace that leads us and guides us along this path and motivates us to follow this path. And eventually it is grace that will swallow us. So everything, all the effort we make in spiritual sadhana, in trying to turn our attention within, that effort is driven only by grace. So we have to think of him, but we will think of him only when he thinks of us. When he decides that he's going to save us, then we are finished. Our fate is a foregone conclusion. So the very fact that he has made us think of him means he has decided, like a spider, he's resolved that he's going to trap us in his grace, trap and ensnare us and imprison us, and finally he will devour us. And likewise in verse 70 he says, Peya niṇaippavar piditiru taneun perumaya ararivara Arunachala. Arunachala, as soon as, it doesn't say I, but it implies I, as soon as I thought of the name, that means your name, implies your name, catching me, you pulled me. Who can understand your greatness? So well, the literal meaning of that verse is, Arunachala, as soon as thought of the name, catching you pulled. Who can know your greatness? What that implies is, as soon as I thought of your name, catching me, you pulled, drew or dragged or attracted me to you. Who can know or comprehend your greatness? So the mere thought of Arunachalam is enough to ensnare us in the web of his grace. So having thought of Arunachalam, we cannot but be saved by him. Therefore, through these and other verses, including this first verse of Akṣaramaṇamālai, Bhagavan has openly disclosed Arunachala's sale, the secret doings, workings, or actions of his grace. As he sings in verse 98, Velibit enun sale verutira dun arul velibit teneka Arunachala. What that means is literally, I have let out your doing, your action, without despising, letting out your grace protect me. What that implies is, Arunachala, through these verses, I have let out your actions. In other words, I've openly disclosed all that you craftily and secretly did in my heart in order to save me, without despising me for doing so, and therefore abandoning me, letting out your grace. That means openly showering your grace, revealing, or it can also mean, because veli means, can also mean revealing, or it can also, veli bittu can mean letting out. It can also mean revealing, but it can also mean revealing the space of your grace, the infinite space of pure awareness. So showering your grace, what it implies is showering your grace openly, protect me, implying by establishing me in the state of kaivalya, pure absolute isolation or liberation, mukti. So Bhagavan, through this Akṣaramaṇamālai, he's revealed the secret workings of Arunachala's grace. So that's why thinking deeply about the meaning of these verses is so important, and it will encourage us so much in the spiritual path, because we may often feel that our Vishaya vasanas are so strong that our mind is constantly going outwards. How will we ever make the effort that is necessary to turn within and thereby develop the love to merge in him? But here, through these verses, Bhagavan is revealing to us how Arunachala's grace will work. Having thought of him, he's trapped us in his, we have thought of him, so he has trapped us in his grace, and he will never fail in his work. So all these verses, he's explaining the aral sale, the work of Arunachala's grace. However, nowhere has he revealed the secret of Arunachala's sale or action as clearly and explicitly as he has done in this 10th verse of Arunachala Padacchēdam. Because in the second sentence of this verse, what he sings is Orutaram idane ortidum virin sheshtaye oduki orutanadu abimukamaha etu ade tambol achalamachedu inuir bali kolum. What this means is subduing the mischievous activities, sheshte. Well, sheshte is a Tamil form of the Sanskrit word sheshte. Sheshte in Sanskrit just means activity, but in Tamil it also has the meaning of mischievous activity. So it's referring here to the mental activity. Mental activity is always mischievous because it's always taking our attention away from ourselves. So subduing the mischievous activity, implying mental activity of the soul who thinks of it even once, pulling it to face towards itself, for one, and thereby making it motionless like itself, it accepts that sweet soul as sacrificial offering. What he implies thereby is as follows. Firstly, when we think of Arunachala even once, it will begin to subdue our sheshte, the mischievous movement or activity of our mind, which implies the outward going movement or activity of our mind. So since our mind goes outward under the sway of our Vishaya vasanas, that is our inclinations to seek happiness outside ourselves in Vishayas, in objects or phenomena, which are the impurities in the mind, we can infer that Arunachala subdues our outward going movements or activities by purifying our mind, which means by reducing the strength of our Vishaya vasanas. And the more we think of Arunachala with love in our heart, the more our mind will thereby be purified. Secondly, to the extent that our mind is purified and its outward going momentum is thereby reduced, we will thereby come under the sway and attraction of the inward pulling magnetic power of Arunachala, who is the one unique awareness that shines eternally and immutably in our heart as I am. And thus it will draw us inwards to be tanadu abhimukham, facing towards itself, which means to be self-attentive. That is, since his true form is that which is shining in our heart as ourself, abhimukham means facing towards. Tanadu means, it can mean it means his own, or it can mean one's own. In other words, facing towards himself, who is ourself, we have to understand it to mean. So he weakens the Vishaya vasanas and thereby subdues the outward going activity of our mind, thereby we come under the sway of that magnetic pull in our heart that draws our mind within to face him alone. And by thus pulling us inwards to be self-attentive, Arunachala will make us motionless like itself, meaning that we will be established firmly in the state of just being as we actually are. This is the same that Bhagavan said in verse 9 of Upadesha Undiyā, by the strength of Bhava Balatina, by the strength of Bhava, that means by the strength of the Ananya Bhava, by the strength of self-attentiveness, being in Sat Bhava. So by pulling our attention within to face himself alone, he thereby establishes us firmly in the state of just being as we actually are. In accordance with what he says in that verse 9, by the strength of meditation, being in Sat Bhava, which transcends bhavana. And finally, since our mind or soul will have been made perfectly ripe by this process of grace, as soon as we become motionless like itself, Arunachala will accept us as a sweet bali. Bali means food that's offered in sacrifice, meaning that he will swallow us, making us inseparably one with him, with itself. So this is how Arunachala roots out the egos of those who think of it even once. So whether we start off by thinking of Arunachala as something other than ourselves, or we go directly to thinking of Arunachala as that which is shining in our heart as I, wherever we start our journey, the goal is the same. Because if we think of him as of him in name and form, he will he will thereby subdue our mental activity, draw our mind within to face himself alone, that is, to face our own real nature, which is his true form, and thereby he will make us motionless like himself and feed upon us. So it's best if we understand that Arunacha is that which is shining in our heart as I, the best way to think of him is to meditate on him only as I. In other words, to meditate on I alone, to be self-attentive. But if we still like to think of him as a form outside, even then it will have the same effect ultimately, because he will unfailingly draw our mind within. So in this verse, Bhagavan explains how, by making us think of itself within our heart, Arunacha leads us naturally and seamlessly from Anyabhava, the state in which we consider it to be Anya or other than ourselves, to Ananyabhava, the state in which we clearly understand it to be Ananya, not other than ourselves, and therefore meditate on it only as I, with intense love, because it is only by the strength of such intensely loving Ananyabhava or self-attentiveness that ego will be eradicated. As I explained earlier, ahattai raṟuppāy means you will eradicate or root out ego or mind. And the ver in raṟuppāy means root, foundation or cause, which is a very significant word in this context for two reasons. Firstly, veraru means to cut the root out or eradicate. So it implies annihilation or complete destruction in such a way that ego can never rise again, even to the slightest extent. Secondly, ego is the root of the vast tree of samsara. Samsara means embodied existence. And it includes all the suffering it entails, and its concomitant, long perpetuating cycle of birth and death. So samsara will end only when this root is cut, eradicated, and removed entirely. Since all phenomena seem to exist only in the view of ourself as ego, ego is the root cause and foundation of all phenomena, as Bhagavan implies in verse 26 of Ulladu. What he says in this verse is, Ahande undayin anatamundahum. If ego comes into existence, everything comes into existence. Ahande indrail indru anatam. If ego does not exist, everything does not exist. Ahande yavamam. Ego itself is everything. Adalal yadu idu endru nadale ovadal yavamena or. Therefore, know that investigating what this ego is alone is giving up everything. Investigating what this ego is, in other words, who am I, alone is giving up everything, because everything else will be given up only when ego is given up. And the nature of ego is to live, endure, and flourish by grasping things other than itself, but to subside and dissolve back into its source by trying to grasp itself, as he implies in verse 25 of Ulladu, the previous verse, that is. I mean, I've just read verse 26, verse 25 is one that precedes that. What he says in this verse, in the final line of this verse, he describes ego as uruvatrapayahande. Uruvatrapayahande means formless phantom ego. And what he says about it is, urupatri undam, grasping form, it comes into existence. Urupatri nikum, grasping form, it stands. Urupatri undu mika ongum, grasping and feeding on form, it flourishes abundantly. Uruvittu urupatram, leaving form, it grasps form. Tedinal otum pidicum, if sought, it will take flight. Since ego is a formless phantom, all the forms it grasps are things other than itself. So what Bhagavan implies here by grasping form is attending to anything other than ourselves. So so long as we are attending to anything other than ourselves, we are thereby nourishing and feed and sustaining ego. So it's only when, instead of grasping other things, we try to grasp ourselves, but ego will subside and dissolve back into its source, as he implies when he says, Tedinalotam pidicum. This is why ego can be eradicated only by turning its entire attention back towards itself to see who am I. As he implies unequivocally in verse 27 of Uludunapadu by asking rhetorically, Nan udikum tanam ade nadamal, nan udia tan irape savadu eban, which literally means, without investigating the place where I rises, namely the fundamental awareness I am, which is the source from which one has risen as ego, the false awareness I am this body. That's what he implies by saying the place where I rises. So without investigating the place where I rises, how to reach the annihilation of oneself in which I does not rise. And this is why thinking of Arunacha as something other than I, aņippava, must therefore lead us eventually to thinking of it as I alone, aņippava. The uniqueness of the name and form of Arunachala is that it has a special power to bring about this crucial change by working from within, working from deep within our heart to draw our attention back within to face towards its true form or swarupa, namely our fundamental awareness I am, as Bhagavan explained in verse 10 of Arunacha Patikam, which I discussed earlier. What we as ego can and must do is turn our attention back within to face ourselves alone, thereby surrendering ourselves entirely to Arunachala. But the actual eradication of ego can be effected only by Arunachala, as Bhagavan implies by saying, ahattai raṟuppāy, you will eradicate ego. That is, as he says in verse 21 of Uludunapadu, Unadal Khan, becoming food is seeing, thereby implying that we can see or know Arunachala, which is what we actually are, only by being swallowed by it. By our turning our entire attention back within, we are offering ourselves as food to Arunachala. And when we attend to ourselves keenly enough, we will thereby sink into the innermost depth of our heart. We will, so to speak, will enter the cave where the lion is waiting for us. And so there we will be swallowed by the infinite clarity of pure awareness, which is Arunacha Swarupa, the real nature of Arunachala. So from this first verse of Akṣaramaṇamālai, we can see how perfectly this love song complements Bhagavan's other more obviously philosophical poems, such as Uludunapadu, Upadesha Undiya, and Atma-vichara. As I said at the beginning, he concludes Uludunapadu by saying in verse 40, Ahande uru aridal mukti. The ego form perishing or being destroyed is mukti, liberation. And he begins Akṣaramaṇamālai by saying in this verse, ahattai raṟuppāy Arunachala, you will eradicate ego. So eradication of ego is the central theme and sole aim of all his teachings. And we can say that where Uludunapadu ends, Akṣaramaṇamālai begins. So from this verse and from so many other verses of Akṣaramaṇamālai, we can understand that in some of Bhagavan's works, he's talking from a more obviously philosophical perspective. In Akṣaramaṇamālai, the philosophy behind it is less obvious, but it's very much there. And if we in order to understand the deep meaning of these verses, the deep meaning and implication of these verses, we have to understand the philosophy that Bhagavan teaches us in versus in his other works like Uludunapadu and Upadeshundya. And Bhagavan's philosophy is an extremely practical philosophy. That is, philosophy without practice is next to useless. Philosophy, the purpose of philosophy is the true benefit we can get from philosophy is to understand that, as Bhagavan teaches us, the only thing worth knowing is ourselves. Before knowing any other thing, we first need to know ourselves. So there's actually a huge amount of philosophy in Aruṇācala Akṣaramaṇamālai, but it's less obvious. And if we understand the meaning of Akṣaramaṇamālai in the light of Bhagavan's other teachings, we will see that love and philosophy are not only complementary, but also inseparable, because love is the motivating force behind any real philosophy. The very word philosophy derives from the ancient Greek philosophia, which is usually said to mean love of wisdom, but actually it means loving wisdom, that is, having love for wisdom. Since wisdom in its deepest and purest form is the infinite clarity of pure awareness that alone remains when ego is eradicated, this love song, whose sole aim is the eradication of ego and seeing what remains, is philosophy of the deepest and most sublime variety. One of the Sanskrit terms for philosophy is darshana, which means view or seeing. The reason philosophy is called view or seeing, it can be explained in several ways. One of them is that there are many different philosophies in India. That is the so-called Astika philosophies, or those that accept the Vedas, and the Nastika philosophies. So there are various ways in which these different philosophies are classified, but it's sometimes said that there are 12. That is materialism, Jainism, 4 types of Buddhism. Those are the Nastika philosophies, those that don't accept the Vedas. And those that do accept the authority of the Vedas include Nyaya, which is basically the philosophy of logic, and Vaiseshika, which is a pluralistic philosophy, and Sankhya, which is a dualistic philosophy, subject-object dualism, and Yoga, which is a set of practices based on the Sankhya philosophy, and Purvamimamsa, which is a way of interpreting the ritual portions of the Vedas, and Uttaramimamsa or Vedanta, which is the interpretation of the philosophical portions of the Vedas. So all these different philosophical viewpoints, they are called darshanas because they're different viewpoints. But there's also a deeper reason why philosophy is called darshana, because the ultimate aim of all philosophy is tattva darshana, seeing what is real. Seeing is here used in the sense of directly knowing or experiencing what is real. So this is what philosophy is all about. And what is real is what actually exists. So when Bhagavan says in the first sentence of the 7th paragraph of Nana, Yatharthamai ulladu Atma-sarupamondre, what actually exists is only Atma-sarupa, he implies that we ourselves, as we actually are, alone are what is real. He confirms this in the first sentence of verse 13 of Uludunapadu, in which he says, Jnanamam tane me, oneself who is jnana alone is real. And also in verse 43 of Akṣaramaṇamālai, in which he says, Tane tane tattvam, idane tane kartavai Arunachala. The first sentence of this verse can be interpreted in 2 ways. Tane tane tattvam, tan means oneself. Tane is an intensified form of oneself. So tane tan means oneself alone is oneself. So tane tattvam, oneself alone is oneself. In other words, I alone am I. That alone is the reality. That's one way we can interpret it. We can also take the repetition of tane to be a repetition for emphasizing oneself alone. Oneself alone is the tattva. But whichever way we take it, whether we take it to mean oneself alone is oneself is tattva, or oneself alone is tattva, they both amount to the same thing. What is the real tattva? It is only ourself. Nothing other than ourself is tattva. Tattva literally means thatness. Tattva is a term that is used to mean what is real, what actually exists. So oneself alone is oneself, alone is the reality, or oneself alone is the reality. That's what tane tattva means. And then Bhagavan sings, idane tane kartavaya Arunachalam. That means, show me this yourself. So show me this yourself means you yourself show this to me. That is, he has to reveal himself to us. He will reveal himself to us only to the extent to which we look within. So we need to look within, and then he will reveal himself to us. And by revealing himself to us, he will thereby annihilate ego. So from these passages of Bhagavan's teachings, we can understand that Swarupa Darshana alone is Tattva Darshana. Swarupa Darshana means seeing ourselves as we actually are, seeing our real nature. And Tattva Darshana means seeing what is real. What is real is only our own nature. So how to see what is real? We have to see our own nature. This is what he implies in verse 16 of Upadesha Saram. Drisya varitum chittam atmanaha chitva darshanam tattva darshanam. That means, actually, when I wrote this in this ashta, I didn't quite understand the meaning of Drisya Bharitam. I took it to mean what is seen warded off, but the actual meaning of Drisya Bharitam is withdrawn from or kept back from Drisya. That means the mind kept back from Drisya is the implication. Kept back from Drisya, the mind seeing its own awareness is seeing what is real. Its own awareness means chitva means its awareness or knowingness. That implies its fundamental, its real nature as pure awareness. So only when the mind sees its own nature as awareness, seeing that is seeing what is real, because what is real is our own nature as awareness. In order to see our own chitva, pure awareness, which is ourself as we actually are, we need to turn back and look deep within ourselves. As he says in verse 44 of Śrī Aruṇācala Akṣaramaṇamālai, Tirambiyaham aham tanai dinamaha kankan teriyum endranayan Arunachala. In this verse, Bhagavan is revealing to us what he was taught by Arunachala. That is the meaning of this verse is Arunachala, what? Meaning, what here implies what a wonder. You said, turning back inside, see yourself daily with the inner eye. In Arunachala can mean Arunachala what? It can also mean my Arunachala. It's got double meaning there. But we can take what in the sense of what a wonder. So what did Arunachala say to Bhagavan? He said, turning back inside, tirambiyaham. Here, aham is used in the sense of inside. Turning back inside, tanne dinam aha kankan. See yourself daily with the inner eye. Daily here implies constantly or persistently. Teriyum, it will be known. What will be known? It will be known the tattva, which is I am I, or tane. So Arunacha obviously didn't teach Bhagavan in words, but Arunacha teaches only through silence. So Bhagavan, because our outward-going minds are too dull to understand the silent teaching of Bhagavan, the silent teaching of Arunachala, Arunachala itself appeared in the form of Bhagavan in order to reveal to us what Arunachala is always revealing through silence. What he's revealing through silence is turning back inside, see yourself constantly with the inner eye, or with an inward look, that implies. Ahattai literally means inner eye, but it implies the inward-facing look. So in order to look deep within ourselves, in order to look so deep within ourselves that we see what we actually are and thereby eradicate ego, we must be willing to give up everything else entirely and forever, as he implies in verse 26 of Uludunapadu. So this requires all-consuming love to know and to be what we actually are. Therefore, if any one thing qualifies as true love for wisdom, philosophia, this is certainly it, because nothing else comes close to it in terms of the depth and intensity of love that it requires. So this is philosophy, this Akṣaramaṇamālai is philosophy in its truest and deepest sense. The language of love poetry is the most suitable means to give voice to this deep and subtle philosophy. And nowhere is this language used more effectively than in this song of pure self-effacing love. This language may not be understood by all who consider themselves to be philosophers, because many such people have a very narrow and limited understanding of what philosophy actually is. So they believe that philosophy is primarily concerned with reasoning, logic, and conceptual analysis. These are, of course, important and necessary tools of philosophy, but they are relatively elementary tools and are useful only at a more superficial level. But real wisdom cannot be found at the superficial level of conceptual understanding and clarity, but only in a much deeper clarity of pure awareness, which can be found only in the depth of one's own heart. If used correctly and wisely, as Bhagavan used them to masterful effect, reasoning, logic, and conceptual analysis can help to point us in the right direction, showing us why real and certain knowledge can be found only cannot be found by any form of objective or outward-looking investigation, but only by investigating who am I, the subject who knows all other things. Reasoning, logic, and conceptual analysis are tools that can be used to justify an extremely wide variety of divergent views, as can be seen from the huge diversity of different and often quite contradictory views and conclusions that philosophers have arrived at from ancient times to the present day. So there is some other factor besides reasoning, logic, and conceptual analysis that determines what each philosopher decides to believe. That other factor is their own likes and dislikes. That is, we each believe what we want to believe, and we use reasoning and logic to justify whatever we want to believe. Philosophers may be more skillful than others in using these tools to justify whatever they want to believe, but in the final analysis, what they believe is determined by what they want to believe, rather than by these tools of their trade. The will, or chittam, is more subtle and therefore more powerful than the intellect or buddhi. So the intellect is a tool driven by will rather than vice versa. Though it is true that a judicious and wise use of our intellect can help us to direct our will in the right direction. That is, if we allow our intellect to be influenced by Bhagavan's teachings, if we listen closely, if we pay close attention to what he says and we think about it deeply, by logical reasoning, we will come to the conclusion that what Bhagavan says is right, and that therefore we should seek knowledge by looking within. So we can use the buddhi, but it needs to be used it needs to be guided wisely. And the main force driving the intellect is the will, where that we direct our will, we direct our intellect in the line in which our will wants it to go. Hence, our will is ultimately what determines whatever we decide to believe. Therefore, any philosopher who fails to recognize the crucial role that their will plays in shaping their philosophy is not a very deep or perceptive philosopher. Only if we understand the crucial role that our will plays in shaping our view of ourselves and everything else, will we begin to see why the language of love is a deeper philosophical language than the language of logical reasoning. Logical reasoning has an important role to play in any philosophical investigation, but love has a much deeper and more impactful role to play. The crucial role played by love will become clear to us to the extent to which our philosophical investigation becomes deep and inward-facing. So its role becomes most obvious to anyone who has clearly understood that all philosophical investigation must ultimately lead to self-investigation, Atma-vichara, which is the deepest and most important investigation of all, and who consequently tries in earnest to investigate who am I by looking deep within their own heart. We can go deep in this path of self-investigation only to the extent to which we have love to surrender ego, and thereby to know and to be what we actually are. And it is only to the extent that we truly have such love that we will be able to understand the profound importance, value, meaning, and implication of this supreme love song, Śrī Aruṇācala Akṣaramaṇamālai. So this is such an important work of Bhagavan. We cannot truly understand Bhagavan's teachings without understanding Akṣaramaṇamālai. To the extent to which we understand Bhagavan's teachings, we will be able to understand Akṣaramaṇamālai. And to the extent to which we understand Akṣaramaṇamālai, we will be able to understand all of the rest of Bhagavan's teachings. So this Arunacha Akṣaramaṇamālai, this is the very heart of Bhagavan's teachings. These are Bhagavan's very deepest teachings are given here in Akṣaramaṇamālai. And also this Akṣaramaṇamālai is, as I think I mentioned last time, Akṣaramaṇamālai is the practical implementation of all of Bhagavan's teachings. That is, when we actually put Bhagavan's teachings into practice, trying to turn our attention within, we face so many obstacles in the form of our own Vishaya vasanas. So Arunacha Akṣaramaṇamālai is teaches us how to win this battle between our sat vasana, our love just to be as we actually are, and our Vishaya vasanas, our inclination to continue seeking happiness outside where there is no happiness at all to be found. So this Akṣaramaṇamālai is an extremely important work. Just from this first verse alone, we can see how much very profound meaning there is in Akṣaramaṇamālai and how intimately it's connected with all of the rest of Bhagavan's teachings. So I don't know how long it is going to take me to get through all the other verses of Akṣaramaṇamālai, even if we proceed slowly, even if some days like today I go overtime in talking about the meaning of any of these verses. It is well worth it because this is such an important text. And to the extent to which we can understand this text, we are coming close to understanding what Bhagavan's teachings are really all about. They're about surrendering ourselves completely and thereby annihilating ego. And we can surrender ourselves only to the extent to which we are willing to give up everything else. So it requires supreme love. Parabhakti tattva, the ultimate love, is nothing but turning within and surrendering ourselves at the feet of Arunachala. That is what Akṣaramaṇamālai is all about. Om Namo Bhagavate Śrī Aruṇācala Ramanaya.